Every week, the Payne family cuts straight to the real financial story.
The one question, Bob, everyone's asking is, are we in an artificial intelligence bubble? You've been through boom and bust. What do you think?
No hype, no myths. Just what actually matters to your money.
Does feel very similar to what we experienced in the 90s. Where are we, though? Are we in 1995, 1997, 1999?
Listen to the Pain Points of Wealth on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
I use Shipt same-day delivery to stay connected with my sister during the holidays. She lives across the country. Shipt has tons of stores to order from. Groceries from Albertsons, crafts from Michael's, even pet supplies from PetSmart. The list goes on. So when we have long-distance movie nights, I turn to Shipt to get face masks, snacks, and everything else we need delivered to her and to me same day. Download the app or visit Shipt.com. That's SHIPT.com.
The Roger Stone Show on the Red Apple Podcast Network.
Many people were shocked when on the morning of January 25th, 2019, when 29 heavily armed FBI agents swarmed my home at 6 o'clock in the morning, that there was a CNN camera crew very conveniently about 25 feet from my front yard. CNN insisted that they were present based on their incisive investigative reporting. In fact, they got an award from the White House Correspondents Association for this stunning scoop of staking my house out 15 minutes before I was arrested. But at 6:11, someone at CNN sent my attorney a copy of my sealed indictment. She said, your client has been arrested. My lawyer responded, for what? And in response, she sent an indictment that had not yet been unsealed by a federal judge. That wouldn't happen until 10:30 in the morning. So I was arrested at 6:11. At 6:22, this document was sent. Now, if you examine the document, you find no timestamps or court markings, but you do, if you go to the metadata tags, find the initials of the man who wrote it, who drafted it, Andrew Weissman. Andrew Weissman is perhaps the single most corrupt, vicious, and sadistic, unethical federal prosecutor in U.S. history. I had read extensively in Sidney Powell's terrific book, License to Lie, Exposing Government Corruption in the Department of Justice, which chronicles Weissman's misconduct in the Enron task force, a decision that he points to constantly without pointing out that his convictions were overturned 9-0 by the U.S. Supreme Court. He ruined both Arthur Andersen, a major accounting firm, and he destroyed the Enron Corporation and sent people to prison when there was no crime or sought to. This is the same Andrew Weissman who reportedly locked a witness in the Enron case in a metal box with a slot for his eyes and left him in the sun until he agreed to testify as to what Weissman wanted. A bar complaint regarding that particular atrocity that was filed with the New York Bar Association has strangely disappeared. A man who knows Andrew Weissman well joins us now. It is criminal defense attorney David Schoen. To my mind, he's one of the finest attorneys in the country. He very ably represented President Donald Trump in his first impeachment, I believe it was. He has been a champion of a particular case that was prosecuted by Andrew Weissman, and that is, of course, the case of two older, now in their 90s, organized crime figures, Michael Sessa and Victor Orena. David Schoen has argued that these men should be pardoned, but his letter to the president, which outlines the reasons why, is an indictment of the epic moral lapses and corruption and lies of Andrew Weissman even before he destroyed Enron, even before he ran the Russian collusion hoax, where he has now been exposed by the declassified documents of Tulsi Gabbard. David, welcome to the Roger Stone Show.
Thank you very much. Very well stated.
So I'm going to kind of sit back here a little bit. Let you tell us about why you have written the president an extremely compelling account on why you believe Michael Sessa and Victor Orena, both of Brooklyn, who are serving life sentences in prison, should be pardoned or otherwise released. Compassionate release requires the approval of a federal judge, so you have written to the president explaining why these men should be pardoned. Later on in the show, Jackie Arena, who is the granddaughter of Vic Arena, who's incarcerated in his 90s, is going to join us. But why don't you lay out this case for us, because it's a tale to be told.
Yeah, I'll explain why I wrote to the president, and I'll explain why I put in a few thousand hours on a pro bono basis in this case. I've never charged a dime and never would, because I'm embarrassed by the injustice that this case represents in our system. And Andrew Weissman, as you say, is right at the heart of it. He didn't act alone. He acted with other prosecutors of a similar bent. John Gleason, George Stembolitis were two of the others, Valerie Caproni. Two of them went on to become federal judges, somehow inexplicable to me. They had this end justifies the means attitude. And I've often said, in my view, at least after 40 years of practicing, but I've said it all along since I found out about this case in the 90s, that Andrew Weissman is the single most ethically bankrupt prosecutor I've ever encountered. And I'm sorry that I've encountered him. It was, at the time of these cases, there was a well-known lawyer in New York who was involved in one of the cases, named Jerry Shargell, and he would refer to Weissman as the pathological liar based on the Saturday Night Live character. He would tell stories about Weissman denying to him that any document existed in discovery, and then during a trial putting it in a stack of papers on his desk and saying, well, look, they've had this document all along. That sort of thing. That's small potatoes compared to what he did in this case with help of others. So I'll just tell you the case from the top. You know, this could go on for days and days, so let me give you a synopsis. Michael Sessa and Vic Arena were accused of being members of an organized crime family, this is a so-called Colombo crime family in New York. In the 90s, and 80s, 90s, there was supposedly a war within the family, two factions going after each other. What we now know is, and by the way, and these folks were sentenced based on the so-called war. What we now know is that a corrupt FBI agent named Lynn DeVecchio, operating under the supervision of Andrew Weissman and the others, was fomenting this war. He had a relationship, corrupt relationship, with an so-called underboss of the family named Gregory Scarpa, a murderous killer, 50 to 100 murders under his belt. And DeVecchio would feed Scarpa information so that Scarpa could then go out and kill a target of his. It was exposed when one day DeVecchio slammed his fist on the table after there was a killing, and one of the other agents heard him say, yes, we're going to win this thing. And so that became a book eventually, based on that line that he used. Cutting to the chase about DeVecchio eventually was charged with multiple murders in connection with this matter. During the course of it, a journalist came up with something he said it was inconsistent that a witness had testified to, and so they dismissed the case against DeVecchio. Nobody could believe it. Never happened in any other kind of case. And the judge wrote quite nicely.
David, let me stop you there. We're going to take a quick break. But what David is saying here is that Andrew Weissman knowingly sent two men to prison for murder that he knew absolutely they did not commit. And he lied with other prosecutors to cover up that fact. We'll be right back. You're listening to David Schoen. We've got him for the next entire segment because this is a tale of mob warfare and government corruption that you won't believe. We'll be right back. Welcome back. We're talking to David Schoen, criminal defense attorney, but also an attorney who has brought some of the most important civil rights, voting rights cases in the country, as well as fighting Islamic terrorists in court. And he joins us now. He wrote a letter to President Trump that said Andrew Weissman was prosecutor in the case against Michael Sessa and Victor Arena, now both in their 90s. Of all the lives Weissman has unfairly ruined through his career of misconduct, the irretrievable harm he did to Sessa and Arena and their families stands alone. You wrote, he took away 33 years of their lives for crimes they did not commit, and he knowingly withheld the evidence demonstrating that they were not guilty. That is a very substantial charge. And it is interesting that you note that he did not act alone, that he acted in concert with others. Very specifically, a former judge, John Gleason, was a prosecutor who was involved in the same cover-up and lies as Andrew Weissman. Gleason would later make an interesting cameo. He would become a federal judge, then he would strangely resign that judgeship when questions about all of this began to be asked. But then after Attorney General Bill Barr moved to have Judge Emmett Sullivan dismiss the case against General Flynn based on prosecutorial misconduct that had shown up in a review of the case, Sullivan refused and instead appointed John Gleason as a new special prosecutor to re-examine the Flynn case, which Judge Sullivan had no legal right to do. It was at that point that President Donald Trump got fed up with the shenanigans of Andrew Weissman, who clearly suggested that. Why? His old partner from Brooklyn, the perfect guy to step into General Flynn's case. David, tell us more here about your examination of the misconduct of Andrew Weissman in the case of Sessa and Arena, and why you feel so strongly that you've done this enormous body of work completely and totally pro bono.
Yeah, listen, Andrew Weissman, you see that they've used him in pockets of prosecution around the country, as you mentioned, the Enron case, all of that, on the Mueller Commission, which is absolutely shocking that he would be the last guy in America to have been on an investigative committee president. But so just to summarize, in this case, Weissman had this corrupt FBI agent, DeVecchio, working under his tutelage on these cases, on the Sessa and Arena cases and other so-called Colombo cases. And DeVecchio had this corrupt relationship with underboss of the Colombo family, who was a serial murderer. We now know, and DeVecchio has admitted finally on Anderson Cooper and elsewhere, that he knew that while he was so-called investigating this case, Scarpa was committing murders on the street. So while they painted the case as an internecine war in the Colombo family, it was DeVecchio and Scarpa fomenting murders and then making cases out of it to pick people up off the street. The ends justifies the means. Most of this stuff, it just started to surface after the Sessa and Arena trials. Sessa and Arena were somewhat suspicious that maybe something was wrong about Scarpa. They asked for information. It was all denied to them. All of the exculpatory information was denied to them by Weissman and Gleason and others in the course of their case. Finally, a couple of years, a short while later, the evidence came out about Scarpa's corrupt relationship. It just barely started to scratch the surface. A very good judge in the Eastern District of New York in Brooklyn, Judge Corman, said, well, that's evidence then that should not be withheld by Weissman and should go to the jury. In each case afterwards, 16 other defendants went forward in front of 4 different juries. That's 48 jurors. They were all acquitted based on the evidence that had been withheld from Sessa and Arena. Sessa and Arena have now been in prison over 33 years. That's twice the average sentence for, they were convicted of these as set up murders in these cases, one each. That's twice the national average for a sentence in a case like this, even if they had done it. And so what's the kind of stuff we're talking about here? So in 1997, 5 years after the conviction, Judge Weinstein, another good judge generally in this district, started to get wind of this evidence. But at that time, it was that maybe there was a corrupt relationship. Maybe DeVecchio was sending information to Scarpa to help him commit murders. But Judge Weinstein said he couldn't believe it. Nevertheless, he said it was a close call as to whether the conviction should stand based on what he knew then. But he just didn't believe that this kind of corruption could have gone on. After this, the next step was the chief judge in Brooklyn, Chief Federal Judge, Judge Sifton, in 1997, wrote an opinion finding the evidence had been withheld and specifically singling out Andrew Weissman for having a myopic sense of ethics, suggested to be reported to the bar. This is beyond belief to me. The U.S. attorney at the time, Weissman's boss, wrote to Chief Judge Sifton and said, please take Andrew Weissman's name out of your order. It hurt his career. Chief Judge Sifton complied. He wrote a new order taking Weissman's name out. I have both orders, the before and after, and I have the letter from the U.S. attorney. Nobody could believe that if I hadn't seen the documents. I think that's what gave Weissman his license to continue the kind of corruption and moral bankruptcy that I've encountered, at least in what I've seen from him. So now, these two men have been sitting in prison, as I say, 33 years. So think about this. Let me just give you an example of the kind of evidence that was withheld. There was a police investigation, for example, in Michael Sessa's case. Who killed a person named Coluccio? We now know, which was withheld at all times before his trial, that there were something like 10 to 12 suspects in the murder, none of whom was Mr. Sessa. One of whom was Gregory Scarpa, the FBI informant who was killing people, we now know, on the street. They knew it at the time. As I say, DeVecchio's admitted giving Scarpa license to kill. He knew that Scarpa was killing. We now have had a top echelon confidential informant come forward named Frank Sparacco, only in recent years, who said that he committed 12 murders. He, Sparacco, committed 12 murders while operating as a confidential informant under the supervision of these people, Weissman, DeVecchio, and so on. It was known that he had license to do it. This is some of the most shocking thing I've ever heard in any case anywhere. So they also withheld in the Sessa case evidence that the primary witness the government had testify against him had been convicted of rape, was being paid a tremendous amount of money by the government. And let me tell you this, he testified that he knew Sessa had committed the murder based on a meeting Sessa attended. The victim of the murder was a person named Coluccio. Mrs. Coluccio, in 2022, wrote a letter to the court saying everything Carmine Imbriali, that witness, testified to at Michael Sessa's trial was a lie. Now, she's writing this letter on behalf of the person convicted of killing her husband. Everything he said was a lie. There was never any such meeting. Her husband and Michael Sessa were very close. She's begging for Michael Sessa to be released from prison. That's in 2022. I want to read you one other thing about Michael Sessa right now. So this is now from the two supervising correctional officers in the U.S. Penitentiary at Lewisburg, one of the toughest prisons in the country, maximum security prison, and is in where he's been incarcerated. He says, I'd like to testify about Mr. Sessa's steady and never wavering moral character. He says he's always been the finest example of a model inmate and a mentor for others. He would be a model citizen if released. He's the only rehabilitated inmate he's ever seen ready for release back into society. And the supervisory correctional officer writes, I'm a U.S. military veteran and will be glad to have Mr. Sessa as my neighbor. Second, another correctional officer supervisor wrote the same thing. This is just, these are in 2020, 2022. That's the kind of person he is. He was sent to prison based on the withholding of evidence, was denied a fair trial completely. Let's talk about Vic Arena. Michael Sessa now is 66 years old. He was never convicted of anything before this. He spent over half of his life in prison. He has children. He has a wife waiting for him. They've never gotten to spend the holidays with him, any of that sort of thing. And by the way, they both certainly qualify for compassionate release, but they can't get a compassionate release because that has to go to a judge in Brooklyn who came out of the same office as Andrew Weissman. Also unbelievable. Other people, everybody else in the case has been released long ago or was acquitted, as I mentioned earlier. Let's talk about Vic Arena. Vic Arena is 90 years old. He has every health ailment known to mankind. He has no idea who he is, where he is. One day he thinks he's president of the United States. Another day he's the warden of the prison. He's confined to a wheelchair. He needs 24-hour assistance every single day of the week. He has had heart attacks. He's had heart surgery. He's considered to be in a terminal condition by the Bureau of Prisons. How on earth can a person like this still be sitting in prison for 33 years? But what about the case against him? He was convicted of killing a person named Tommy O'Sera. So as I mentioned before, Frank Sparacco, part of the top echelon confidential informant program that the Department of Justice has testified that he told the government, he told Weissman early on in the case that Vic Arena didn't commit this murder. John Gotti ordered this murder on his own agenda, and the Colombo family was against it. That's a memorandum. It never surfaced before I got a hold of it when Frank Sparacco came forward to tell these kinds of things that he saw. Basically, the story we've heard from these confidential informants is that Weissman, Gleason, Stambolitis ran the courts back then. They would tell the judges what to do, and the judges would comply, and no one would call them on their unethical conduct. It's absolutely shocking. And we see Weissman go on with a career like that. And so that's why I've worked on this case for thousands of hours, on my own. And that's why I'm asking the president to consider a pardon or to commute their sentences and let them go home finally. Look, Vic Arena at 90 and with full dementia and terminal condition doesn't have much to look forward to in life, but his family wants him home. They need him home. He's a grandfather. He's a great-grandfather. Michael Sessa has a lot of his life left to live. I've read to you already what the people who have known him for over a decade in a tough prison, tough conditions, for a guy who's sitting there and doesn't belong there. And they said he's just a model. He's done 75 hours continuing education to better himself. He meets with a chaplain every week. He's Catholic. He goes to services every week. And Vic Arena, too. Vic Arena did a program with the NAACP. He got ordained as a minister in prison. Top-notch character before he had dementia, of course. And so these are the kinds of people, number one, should be released under any circumstances because of the amount of time they served in prison, double what people usually serve for these crimes, even if they did it. But secondly, based on the kind of misconduct engaged in by Andrew Weissman and this crew in the Eastern District, they never had even the close to a fair trial in any way, shape, or form in their cases.
Yeah, it's really not surprising that Andrew Weissman goes on to be the general counsel at the FBI. It's in that role that he hears and knows that the Steele dossier, which is later used as a justification for the launching of the Mueller investigation, as well as for the FISA warrants to spy on Donald Trump, is a fraud. He's well aware that it's a fraud, yet he lets it go forward. I think most people understand that Andrew Weissman was the de facto head of the Mueller investigation. Mueller's subsequent testimonies tried to bolster his final report was a disaster. It was clear that Mueller was already suffering from early dementia. Now he is completely incapacitated, according to his family and his attorney. So Andrew Weissman was running the witch hunt. He is the one who dreamed up the case against Donald Trump. He's the one who implemented the Russian collusion hoax, even though he could never come up with any real evidence of Russian collusion. After spending $30 million plus, at the end of the day, he said, Paul Manafort passed proprietary polling information to a guy who was a Russian intelligence asset, and there's your Russian collusion. The problem with that is the man that he identifies as a U.S. intelligence asset. So Andrew Weissman goes on from this early history of lying and prosecutorial misconduct in Brooklyn to destroy the Enron Corporation and then to attempt to destroy Donald Trump. We're talking with David Schoen. I want to ask him about the legal surroundings regarding Letitia James, the New York Attorney General, when we come right back. You're listening to The Roger Stone Show. Whatever you do, don't touch that dial. And we're back. We're talking with David Schoen, criminal defense attorney, civil rights attorney, voting rights attorney, probably the smartest lawyer that I know. He's written a compelling letter to President Donald Trump regarding Vic Arena and Michael Sessa, arguing that Andrew Weissman knew that both were innocent, yet both got life sentences. And this is really not surprising. In the case of Weissman, he very clearly had me under investigation as a de facto head of the Mueller investigation, yet I was never called before the grand jury. He was in touch with my lawyers, but they would confirm nothing. And then when I was pardoned, he demanded that I be brought before a grand jury. It is an absurdity. And, of course, in my case, as you know, David, the judge withheld exculpatory evidence that was hidden by Andrew Weissman. Specifically page 178 of Mueller's final report, which was long redacted and withheld from the public and from my defense attorneys at trial. Mueller's final report admits that he had no evidence of Russian collusion, WikiLeaks collaboration, or any other crime on my part. So Weissman basically constructed these process crimes in order to pressure me to testify falsely against Donald Trump. Yeah. David, with the few minutes that we have left, I want to switch gears with you here. Yeah. Letitia James was successfully prosecuted in the Eastern District of Virginia by Lindsay Halligan, who was the interim U.S. attorney. She took that case for mortgage fraud and bank fraud to a grand jury. They gave her a full bill of indictment. That case was thrown out because the courts found her appointment to be constitutionally faulty. That is now being appealed in the federal courts. But then it is reported that the government went 2 more times to the grand jury and could not win an indictment in what is a documents case, which seemed to me to be a fairly simple case. I mean, either Letitia James did or did not sign a document that, based on the facts at the time, was false. You've examined this case. What do you think?
I think based on the evidence that first grand jury found that Lindsay Halligan presented to, all, as you say, based on documents, they have Attorney General James coming and going. You know, I've written a piece to suggest that at a minimum, the public has to demand what went on here, because if you read the indictment that was returned originally, it was only dismissed because of that procedural issue that you've raised. If you read that indictment, let's say there was a property in Norfolk, Virginia that Ms. James bought. And according to the indictment, she represented one status to the mortgage company, the bank, the lending institution. That is, that it would be used as a secondary home. And then, according to the indictment, represented to the IRS that she never used it for personal use, had 0 personal use dates, which would disqualify it as a secondary residence, and took some expenses as if it were not a secondary home, but an investment property. There's got to be much more to this thing. The questions that need to be asked are, did she take out an insurance policy on the home? Of course she did, with the mortgage and so on. How did she characterize it there? Secondary home, primary home, or an investment property? Did she ever make a claim, an insurance claim on the property? Was there any insurance fraud that went on with this? And again, the taxes have to be examined and so on. All of this was avoidable. Lindsay Halligan has done a heck of a job on very short notice, coming in here, learning the system, presenting the case to the grand jury, just based on the evidence, without an agenda. And so the court said that she wasn't properly appointed. All the Department of Justice had to do was have another prosecutor, an assistant United States attorney, sit in the grand jury room with her when it was presented. And like every other case in which there's a question about the appointment of the prosecutor, so far that's been litigated, the indictment itself would not have been dismissed, period. This is the only case that the indictment was dismissed because the only person who presented it was the person whose appointment is under question. But there are many ways around this. The government the DOJ could have done with a commitment to this case. The public has to demand answers in this case. And remember, by the way, this was the second property at issue. There was a property that came up originally in which she apparently signed a document with 2 witnesses that was submitted in connection with a mortgage application that said to her lawyer that said this was the other property was a primary residence, a residence in Virginia, while she's acting as Attorney General in New York. There's a lot there.
Yeah, there's no question about that. The irony here, of course, is Letitia James herself, as New York Attorney General, has prosecuted people for this exact crime, the crime she was accused successfully by Lindsay Halligan, the interim U.S. Attorney. I do think that the government will prevail in their appeal of Halligan's appointment, but unfortunately, James Comey got off on the same basis, and his case has hit the statute of limits. Thank you for our guest, David Schoen. We'll be right back, and Jackie Arena, one of the victims of Andrew Weissman, joins us.
Thanks for listening to The Roger Stone Show. You can hear The Roger Stone Show Sunday afternoons at 3. If you like the podcast, share it with your friends and listen anytime at WABCRadio.com and download the WABC Radio app. Hit that subscribe button on all major podcast platforms. Plus, follow WABC on social on Instagram, TikTok, Facebook, and X. See you next time for a new episode so you never have to wonder,
what the heck is going on here?
Every week, the Payne family cuts straight to the real financial story.
The one question, Bob, everyone's asking is, are we in an artificial intelligence bubble? You've been through boom and bust. What do you think?
No hype, no myths. Just what actually matters to your money.
Does feel very similar to what we experienced in the 90s. Where are we, though? Are we in 1995, 1997, 1999?
Listen to the Pain Points of Wealth on the Red Apple Podcast Network.